Welcome back to FreightWaves Now. We've got some breaking news this morning. Going to have special guest, founder, CEO Craig Fuller here. Big news in the truckload space, seeing CFI being purchased from TFI International, being bought by Heartland Express for $525 million.
Yeah, it's a big deal. It's a big deal for a lot of reasons. I think, first of all, this is another significant transaction that Heartland's done. And what's really interesting about Heartland over the last 5 years, they've been much more aggressive in acquiring companies and really taking on what we call more risky decisions than what they've historically been known for. When I was growing up in the trucking business, Heartland was a very conservative. They basically had no debt. They paid cash for everything. They never did these big monster deals. But really over the last, say, 5, even 10 years, they've really stretched on making acquisitions. So they bought Interstate, they bought Gordon, they bought Bar None. They've been really speculative, and now they buy probably the most storied north-south I-35 NAFTA carrier in CFI.
Yeah, and when you think about this, I mean, they've been active in the space. I mean, just this year with the purchase of Smith Transport earlier this year for $170 million. I mean, you're seeing them start to really get in this. I know my dad's talked about it before. He goes, Heartland doesn't do things that don't make them money. I mean, when you think about their historic ORs, I mean, where do you think this fits in? I think in their press release, they talk about trying to get to that 85 OR within the 3 years. I mean, that's kind of where everybody strives to be.
Well, Heartland's done it before.
Yeah.
This is not this is a model. It's a company that executes exceptionally well. Mm-hmm. They are one of the best financial operators in the truckload for hire truckload business, which is a very difficult business to make money in. But I think, look, I have absolute confidence in management. They did stumble when they bought Gordon. It took a little bit to digest it, but then they bought Interstate. That seemed to go exceptionally well. I think it's a company you have to bet on the management team. It's the same management team that's been in place for many, many decades. I have a lot of confidence that they will be able to take this acquisition and make it part of their core operations.
Absolutely. Now, from the other perspective, right, we've talked about TFI. They've been in the news, but they've been buying up, UPS Freight, the LTL carrier there. That's where they've been, and you talked about earlier, Knight-Swift, making those acquisitions in the LTL space. What do you think, or why do you think you're making a move, like Heartland's making a move? I know that's where their head or focus is that over-the-road trucking, but you haven't seen a lot of, big acquisition or big carriers going after other OTR carriers.
It's difficult because the problem is in the truckload, for-hire truckload business is there aren't economies of scale. So the issue is really when you're buying an asset-based truckload operator, all of the trucking companies, whether it's Heartland, Knight-Swift, Warner, whomever you're talking about, they see every bid package. And so really when they buy a trucking company, what they're effectively buying, they're not buying normally customers is what they're buying. They're buying a little bit of network sort of density, but they're also buying drivers. That's really the sort of the purpose. And so what we see with Heartland's strategy is they're buying very high quality carriers that have high quality driver pools that can fit well into their operation. And so that creates its own set of challenges. I think one of the most interesting things is TFI has been known as this big acquirer, sort of rolling up the industry, performing very exceptionally when they do it. They're offloading one of the most storied names. CFI owned, between them and Celadon back in the sort of 90s and early 2000s, they owned that NAFTA I-35 corridor. They were the dominant player on that north-south lane. It's interesting because we're seeing TFI say that they may not want to play in the more commoditized truckload space by selling it off. They still have a couple of assets in the for-hire truckload space. Transport America is a company that they bought many, many years ago. It's still a part of the portfolio. We don't hear about that. We strictly hear about the CFI operation.
Yeah, I think what's interesting, you touched on it right there, buying the drivers. But, you look at this deal, and they're buying that non-dedicated business for the company.
The commoditized.
Yeah,
this
exactly.
is a commoditized business that's subject to a lot of market swings. This is not the high quality sort of dedicated operations that every trucking company wants to be or wants to buy.
Yeah. Now, when you're going, we've talked about it all the time. Me and Donnie just talked about it on the first carrier update. The spot market, you're seeing it just collapse, right? I mean, I think we hit $2.60 on the NTID today. So, I mean, we're seeing the spot market collapse. Why do you think making a deal in this non-dedicated space, I mean, why? You said you had confidence in this management team, and I think you have to when you look at the results over the past few years, especially with the violent swings we've seen in the market. What makes this make sense, I guess, right now when you see the market deteriorating?
Well, they're paying 5 times EBITDA, which is not the upper end of a range. It's sort of what we call a sort of a mid-market range. So it's interesting, if you go back to the transaction when Conway bought CFI way back in the day before XPO owned Conway, they paid $750 or $800 million, if memory serves it right. So it actually, we've seen some value sort of taken away in terms of the valuation of the company. I think Heartland's making a bet on the truckload market. But the really important thing about CFI is it has that north-south corridor, that I-35 corridor, which if you sort of bet on reshoring or sort of that bringing back commerce into Mexico and the US and Canada, you sort of believe that the North American story is going to play out and we're going to start to move our supply chains back to the domestic market, then you sort of, the bet makes complete sense. This is a long-term bet. It's not going to really challenge Heartland's financial viability in any way whatsoever. I think it's a really smart bet for them. It's a really smart pickup, but I think it also tells us a lot about just the lack of desire around truckload assets. Nothing against CFI. I think it's probably arguably the highest quality private asset, or we'll call it subway. I mean, it's part of TransForce, which is public, but it's still one of the highest quality assets that you can own. And I think a lot of credit to them for what they've built. They're going to own that I-35 corridor. Celadon's out of business, which is good for CFI's business, but I think it's a really smart move. One of the things you have to sort of look at is the companies that are really acquisitive. So TFI has been really acquisitive in the space and arguably the best integrator. We saw Knight-Swift earlier this year buy AAA Cooper, which is an LTL operator. We're seeing companies start to say, I don't want to be in that commoditized truckload space. I want to own assets that are more integrated logistics assets, that maybe it's LTL, maybe what J.B. Hunt's been doing around last mile acquisitions. I think the M&A play is less about buying commoditized truckload and more about buying these really interesting logistics assets. We've seen Covenant completely transform its business model and has done exceptionally well, not by investing in truckload, but investing in managed warehouses and managed trans.
Absolutely. I think, again, you mentioned it. It's a really interesting deal, and the timing of it seems it is that bet on the U.S. and that truckload market. I mean, you look at it, it'll become the 8th largest truckload fleet in the country, which, I mean, Heartland was already big, and now you're adding and becoming this massive player in the space. It'll be
third irregular route for hire.
Yeah.
So it puts it in the class of, you have Werner, you have Schneider, you have U.S. Express, you have now Heartland. You've got just a big dominant players in that for-hire market. And what's interesting about that is that they now have a lot of assets to bring to the table and highly differentiated assets. The other acquisitions they made, Smith is a Northeastern carrier. We know that Gordon and Interstate are Pacific Northwest carriers. That I-35 corridor is what CFI is.
Absolutely. Well, I'll put one final question here for you. Do you think we see any more in the truckload M&A space here in the back half of the year?
Absolutely, and explain why. Is that this is a point in time, you talked about the spot market collapsing. We're seeing now contracts come down. They've dropped about 8% since the start of, really, since June. And, we're projecting at least a double-digit decrease. I think it could be as high as 20. It could even be bigger depending how much the drawdown and slowdown in the economy in contract. And I think it's going to put a lot of pressure on balance sheets. And I think we're going to see a lot of companies, not because they want to sell, they should have sold last year if they wanted to sell, but because they have to sell. They have to shore up their balance sheets. It's an opportunity where the strong are going to get stronger and the weaker are just going to be in a situation where they aren't going to have a lot of options. Debt markets freeze up. We know that in these cycles, banks pull back and investing in trucking companies. We know that investor appetite really dries up. I think it's going to be very difficult for a lot of those companies that have a lot of debt and perhaps not great cash flow situations are going to have to think strategically. The challenge is going to be that if you're a Heartland, if you're a Knight Swift, if you're a Schneider, and a few others, you may have the opportunity to pick the premium brands. And I think this Heartland CFI acquisition is probably the most impressive transaction we've seen this year in the for-hire truckload space.
Absolutely. Well, Craig, thank you so much for joining us this morning to talk about this acquisition. Stay tuned to more stay tuned to freightwaves.com, where we'll be talking about this story much more. Right now, we'll toss it over to Kaylee Nix with our first look at weather.